To my experience, few Americans adequately understand politics. Most don't. On average, people in other countries understand their politics better than we know ours. They even know ours better than we do, while we know little of ours and nothing of theirs. Every time I see one of those man-on-the-street interviews, like at a Trump rally, for example, I weep at how those people don't understand things. They tend to think in binary, where everything is black or white, or in this case, red or blue, right or left, good or evil, capitalist or communist, where everyone is an extremist in one way or another. You're either a good and godly conservative Republican with family values, or you're an evil, liberal Democrat and a godless commie pinko. Pink. Why pink? Because someone realized that maybe you're not completely communist, but only a commie sympathizer. Thus, you're one of the Reds, which was the old name for commies. But you're diluted a bit, watered down, such that you're only pink, and thus a pinko. But why would the commies be known as the Reds when they're on the left, and the left is blue? Republicans are red, but they're not commies, so they're not the Reds. They're not the blues either, because the blues are black music. While in the U.S., the extreme right is supremely white. And just as white fades to black on a grayscale, red fades to blue by turning purple. Because in politics, you can't have a left wing and a right wing unless you also have a middle. And some of my countrymen are so dumb that they think it's a clever argument to point out that left and right wings both belong to the same bird. The implication being that the whole bird is bad. But understand that the bird is your society, wherever you live, whatever society that is. There's going to be politics in every population. So wherever you live, you are part of that bird. Now, what part of that bird are you? Centrists are people who may lean right or left of that center line, but they don't go to extremes. They stay in the middle of the road. They're moderates, liberals, not leftists, because they're not far enough to the left to be called leftists, nor are they far enough to the right to be called conservatives or right-wingers. So we got red, blue, and purple, but it's still not that simple. There are gradations in the purple: magenta, lavender, mauve, periwinkle, plum, and violet, meaning intermediate positions between the extreme left and right. Starting from communism, which is ideally and perhaps impossibly supposed to be an egalitarian society in which there is no poverty and no hierarchy of social classes. Theoretically, anyway, because no attempt at realizing communism has ever even come close to what it was supposed to be. Instead, every attempt thus far became the very thing that it tried not to be. And moving from the far left to the right, we next come to socialism. Now, according to Marxism, socialism is just a path to communism. But if you're not a Marxist, then socialism can be the end goal. Here we have democratic socialists, and then we have social democrats who are not socialists. And several Americans have told me that I can't be on the left unless I'm a socialist, because they think that being leftist means socialist. But then those same idiots also think that Marxism means socialism, and that socialism is another word for communism, and that communism means fascist, because they're so stupid they don't know what any of these words mean. When I was a little kid, my family would spit out the words communism or socialism like they tasted bad, as if saying socialism was like going number one and saying communism was like going number two, but out of your mouth. I knew at that time a basic definition of communism, and I didn't know one for socialism. But I had an impression that they must be different things. How could socialism lead to communism if socialism is communism already? So I asked my family to explain the difference between socialism and communism. After a moment of wide-eyed, exasperated confusion at someone trying to understand things rather than simply believing whatever they were told to believe just because they were told to, they finally replied by yelling into my face that they're both just as bad. I knew then that even as a little kid that they didn't know what they were talking about. No more than I did. That was decades before the internet, which says that socialism and communism differ significantly in their goals, methods, and views on property. Under communism, all property is communally owned, and the government controls all economic production to eliminate social classes. By contrast, socialism allows for personal property and small businesses with an emphasis on collective control of major industries to reduce inequality. I can't even imagine my family knowing how to give an answer like that. And just to the right of democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders and Noam Chomsky are the social democrats like me. We don't want full-on socialism, certainly not communism, but we still want strong social programs like Social Security and universal health care and food regulations, environmental protections, and so on, because we believe that capitalism needs to be regulated, restricted, so as not to run amok like it wants to. We know that corporations will do anything to be able to do anything they want, to harvest, pollute, or otherwise destroy the world and the future just for a better profit margin in the next fiscal quarter. That's why there need be regulations. So, not all leftists are socialists, and not all leftists are Democrats either, nor are all Democrats leftists. Most Dems are moderates, and there are right-wing conservatives, the old ones, like Biden. Most of the rest are liberals, not leftists. Although there are some progressive leftists in there now, too. About 38% of congressional Democrats are leftist, so we're getting there. Liberals are more in the middle of the political compass, not so much on the left. If that confuses you, it's only going to get worse in a moment. Continuing to the right, we then have libertarians and capitalists, and all the way to social Darwinism, which is weird that the extreme right would be Darwinists, since they're mostly fundamentalist Christians and don't believe in Darwin. But remember that social Darwinism pertains to economy, not biology. That wasn't Darwin's idea, that was an economist named Herbert Spencer. It is predatory economics, with the rich figuratively feeding off the poor, such that the rich get richer, the middle class become impoverished, and the growing population of the poor only get poorer. Capitalism is quite the opposite of the communist ideal, isn't it? And not necessarily better, either. In fact, capitalism is based on continuous growth, exponential growth, because it consumes everything. That's why capitalists are not environmentalists. If left unchecked, unregulated, unrestricted, capitalism will eventually exhaust every worker and deplete every resource, leaving only a wasteland, with one last aged codger dying alone on a mountain of money that he can no longer spend. And what I'm suggesting is that a mix of these ideologies would be better, with socialism and capitalism both working together but also mutually bound, holding each other back. And that may sound like a knife fight with your hands tied to your opponent, but it doesn't have to be. So now we've gone from a binary concept to a dimension. But there's not just one. There is another, possibly more important dimension, the one between authoritarianism and libertarianism, meaning how much control government has over people who maybe just want to be left alone on their own. I think Monty Python's comparison of an absolute monarch versus an anarcho-syndicalist commune illustrates this contrast nicely. It's also important to remember that there have been a few times in history when the poor rose up to overthrow the rich and thus erect a better system, one that benefits everyone, where the rich pay more taxes, the poor pay less, and where circumstances contribute to a robust middle class and a higher standard of living for everyone, even the poor. However, in the U.S., the rich protect their hoarded treasures by controlling the media and producing propaganda that has the poor busily looking for enemies on their left or their right, so that they don't all get the idea to look up and see where the real problem is. Libertarianism, also known as anti-authoritarianism, should not be confused with the Libertarian Party, which exists exclusively in the yellow quadrant of this illustration, on the lower right quadrant of the political compass. There are libertarian leftists, I'm one of them, but the Libertarian Party is exclusively right-wing. Now, why would oligarchs want the rabble to only know or hear about the left and right? Never the other axis. And that's probably because Look all along the edge of the authoritarian right quadrant. Feudalism, colonialism, imperialism, absolute monarchy, Genghis Khanism? None of these are the type of society that we really want to live in, so we should probably stop voting for that. And now we have a two-dimensional representation. If this political compass looks confusing, it might be because there is arguably a third or z-axis between conservatism and liberalism. I know, you first thought that liberals were on the left, but then you learned that they're more toward the middle, but not really. And they're not on the bottom either. Instead, they're on the front or back side. I'm not sure. But how do you represent that on paper? And maybe that's why this illustration, with different font sizes, seems to have conservatism in the front and liberalism in the back. Some of these political ideologies may be better understood if thought of as being at some depth within a cube. But since we can only draw it as a square, being limited to two spatial dimensions in these illustrations, then you just have to remember that liberalism is different from classical liberalism, which is also different from neoclassical liberalism. The most important thing to remember here is that despite how polarized our population has become, there are really few extremists. Not many even can live so far out on the edge of society. We have to live somewhere inside the bounds, and most of us usually land somewhere toward the middle. Oh, and here you have progressive conservatism, two things that are individually usually considered to be opposite of each other. Progressivism is a left-leaning position by definition. And that may be because the political compass is not as well understood as the periodic table. This is all conceptual, and we're still figuring it out. So it's all subject to reevaluation and even evolution in the basic sense of a change over time. For example, note how this depiction has blue on the right and red on the left. Why does the United States have that backwards? Because in Europe, red is associated with left-leaning parties and ideologies, meaning that they favor the working class, while blue is associated with right-leaning parties and conservatism, which tend to favor the aristocracy. It used to be that way here, too. The Democratic Party was always blue because it used to be the Conservative Party. The Republican Party were never left-leaning, but they were once to the left of Democrats. I know this requires explanation. Why am I even talking about this? When we first list the myriad compounded issues with religious right, Republican, conservative, Christian nationalists, and this administration in particular, not just the multiple attempted criminal cover-ups, but their constant failures to administrate without violating the Constitution, there are people who voted for this administration who are now painfully having to face the fact of those several significant failures. But they don't seem to be able to criticize their own party without evoking the tu quoque fallacy of sharing the blame with the accusation that you're just as bad. So they have to say that the Democrat Party is somehow at fault for what the Republicans did. I've heard that a lot. I'm impressed at the fact that the MAGA GOP is the worst thing America has ever done to itself. That religious right conservatives have been the enemies on the wrong side of every issue throughout the entirety of my career as an activist. But that there are people who have been so conditioned by right-wing propaganda that they have an irrationally ingrained hatred of Democrats, blinding them to the reality that the normal, same old, just like always status quo cannot logically be the same as the new and disproved, unprecedented, absolute worst that we've ever seen by orders of magnitude. Both parties famously have and had liars, cheats, and thieves, but Bill Clinton is retired now. Democrats also have some good people doing good things. Look at Jasmine Crockett, for example. Republicans used to have better congressmen than they do now, but those better people all quit and were replaced by crazy, bigoted, incompetent idiots. The people who refused to vote for this administration will usually put the blame where it belongs, but there are a lot of others who insist that both sides are just as bad. I think this argument would have carried more weight 10 years ago and probably would have been a fair statement 50 years ago when writer Gore Vidal said that there is only one party in the United States, the Property Party, and it has two right wings, Republican and Democrat, because the DNC was never left-wing. Over the course of my life, we've had Democratic presidents and we've had Republican presidents, but we've never had a left-wing president. Obama was not a socialist, nor a Muslim either. Biden was definitely not a radical leftist like the right likes to say that he is. Neither of them were leftist at all. Every president of my lifetime was on the authoritarian right quadrant of the political compass. We've had leftist candidates. For example, Bernie Sanders is in the diametrically opposite quadrant, the libertarian left, just one increment to the left of me. But no left-winger has ever won the presidency. I thought that JFK might have been a leftist because he seemed so progressive. I thought that Jimmy Carter might have been a leftist because he was building houses for the homeless. But no, it turns out that the most left-leaning president of my lifetime was Republican Richard Nixon. Nixon signed the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and he started the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He also expanded the welfare state, proposed guaranteed income, and provided supplemental security income with the Family Assistance Plan. He pushed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and he created the Environmental Protection Agency with an executive order. All things that today's Republicans would have called socialist. This was back when Republicans and Democrats were pretty much the same thing. Whether you accept evolution or not, you have to accept that things change over time, and that goes for our political parties too. What happened? In the 60s, the Republican Party tried to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to racism against African Americans. This conscious decision to become more overtly racist was called the Southern Strategy, and it caused Democrats to become less racist by attracting more black voters and alienating their own resident white supremacists. And while it is true that 100 years ago the Democratic Party was the party of the Ku Klux Klan, things have changed over the last 50 years, such that every Klansman is a Republican now. And most black people now vote Democrat, where they wouldn't have a century ago, even though the Republican Party was started by the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. Isn't it funny that the party that is all about Christian nationalism was begun by Lincoln, who refused to identify as a Christian? As a result of the Southern Strategy, Democrats and Republicans swapped some of their policies. If I were already an adult in the year that I was born, 1962, I would have been a proud Republican then. Back then, the marriage I have now would have been illegal because my wife is half European and half Asian. In 1962, that was illegal for white people to marry anyone who wasn't white. And you had to be all white to be white at all. If you're only 4/5 white, that's not white enough. If you had one drop of anything else in your blood, then that's all you were, whatever that one drop is. It's amazing how ignorant this country has seemingly always been. A century ago, Democrats were more conservative, which is why they were always blue. Republicans were more liberal, which is why they are red. They started out as moderates, but leaned to the far right, while Democrats started out on the far right and leaned slightly left until they crossed each other. That switch of party policies is why our red and blue doesn't match Europe's red and blue. At the point when Nixon took office, the two parties were very much alike. They were still close to that crossing point, but they continued growing apart, such that over the last half century or so, things have changed. The Democratic Party still isn't necessarily left. By European standards, the Democrats are right-wing, just not as far right as the average Republican is now. Even by American standards, the DNC isn't really left-wing. They're only to the left of Republicans. Which is funny that Republicans think that Democrats are leftists, and they think that leftist means Marxist, and that socialist is communist, and that they're all fascist. Which is especially funny because fascism is the opposite of socialism. Fascism is right-wing by definition. All those others are left-wing. But we can't expect Americans to know what they're talking about, can we?
Leaders cannot call their political opponents Nazis and fascists and enemies of the state because they disagree with their policy priorities. I mean, this is something we should have learned in grade school.
It is the enemy from within, and they're very dangerous. They're Marxists and communists and fascists.
You know, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. This is communist, this is Marxist, this is fascist.
It's the enemy from within. That's a bigger enemy than China and Russia. There's a radical left Marxist, communist, fascist. She's a Marxist. She's a fascist. These far left fascists, led by Harris and her group, they're scum. They're scum. And they want to take down our country. They are absolute garbage.
The term far left fascist is nonsense, another oxymoron. Donald Dumbass is effectively calling Kamala Harris a far right leftist. How can she be on the far left and the far right at the same time? It's impossible to be a far left fascist. And she's neither left nor fascist. The biggest problem leftists have with her is that she's not a leftist. She's yet another middle-of-the-road centrist like Biden. If they're going to accuse all Democrats of being leftist, if even the liberals, moderates, and right-wing conservatives are all allegedly leftist, if they vote Democrat at all, then Democrats ought to put some candidates up who actually are on the left, with policies that people actually want. I think Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is a good example of that. And just to remind you, the left is typified by prioritizing human rights, equality, and quality of life for everyone, and the environment over the greed and grift of corporate corruption. People over profits. If you care about the working class, about the rights of poor people, disabled, and all of that, with regulations to guarantee the quality of our food and water and housing and all of that, then you lean left. Whereas the right doesn't care about the working class. The right serves the billionaire class, being bought and sold, owned and controlled by corporations and oligarchs. And they believe exactly what they're told because that's how they were raised. I remember reading the National Party platforms for both Democrats and Republicans back around Y2K. Even then, they were pretty much the same thing. Republicans were a bit more religious at that time, but the difference wasn't that much then. A decade or so later, they had grown further apart. This is when the Democratic Party caused a schism in their ranks by trying to insert religious references into their National Party platform. They did not get the two-thirds vote that they needed, much to their surprise.
A motion has been made. Is there a second? Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, the matter requires a two-thirds vote in the affirmative. All those delegates in favor say aye. All those delegates opposed say no. In the opinion of the... Let me do that again. All of those delegates in favor say aye. All those delegates opposed say no. I guess.
And then you gotta let them do what they're gonna do.
I'll do that one more time. All those delegates in favor say aye. All those delegates opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds have voted in the affirmative. The motion is adopted, and the platform has been amended as shown on the screen.
But those in charge made the change anyway, against the eruption of disapproval across the auditorium. In that same year, the Republican Party had become so religious that one of their platforms declared objections to teaching evolution, to teaching anthropogenic climate change, and practically anything about the civil rights movement. They even objected to critical thinking, on the excuse that being able to think critically would challenge a student's fixed, as in unreasonable, beliefs, and thus undermine parental authority. A tacit admission that their religion was never about truth, it's about control. While the Democratic Party is still moving left, and almost is on the left now, not all leftists are Democrats, and not all Democrats are leftists. That's the problem. Most American leftists usually vote Democrat, though not all of them, and that's why Bernie ran as a Democrat even though he was technically an independent. I would be too, but I live in Texas, where independents can't always vote in the state primaries. You have to be registered as one of the two main parties or you get locked out of part of the process. Analytic philosopher and cognitive scientist Professor Noam Chomsky says that Democrats are center-right, while Republicans have moved so far to the right that they are not so much a political party as a radical insurgency. He says that both parties ultimately serve a pro-business agenda, while true left-wing and working-class interests are largely ignored by the political establishment. And that's why all the more mature countries have national health care systems, and we still do not. Remember when Bernie proposed a universal health care system? Yeah, your health care would be funded by taxes, so your taxes would go up a bit, but not nearly as much as what we are currently paying for our insurance, which you wouldn't have to pay for at all anymore. So on balance, you would actually pay substantially less and still get more with no deductible. Brilliant! But we can't have that, because then insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies wouldn't be able to charge us the highest rates and prices of any nation in the world, because the super rich gotta get even richer no matter what it costs the rest of us. That's why we can't have nice things. This is why I say that this country needs to take a hard left turn.